Poor people are poor people, and they don't understand. A man's got to make whatever he wants and take it with his own hands. Poor people stay poor people, and they never get to see. Someone's got to win in the human race. If it isn't you, then it has to be me. So smile while you're making it. Laugh while you're taking it. Even though you're faking it, nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know. No use mumbling, it's no use grumbling. Life just is.
Someone has to win in the human race. If it isn't you, then it has to be me. That song was written in the 70s by Alan Price. It was a soundtrack of a great movie, Oh Lucky Man. I got to know this just as Margaret Thatcher was about to storm 10 Downing Street and change the world with the myth of neoliberalism, which was precisely that. Somebody has to win, so it's going to be me. And poor people are just poor people because they don't get to see. They make bad choices in life. That was then, this is now. And this is another now, DiEM25's program that tries to find silver linings in this complete catastrophe. And it is a complete catastrophe if you look at the hundreds of millions of people who are going hungry tonight that wouldn't have gone hungry had financialized capitalism not been in the fragile state it was before COVID-19 hit. One of the silver linings that we've been talking about this program, and which I have been hanging on for hope, is the fact that politics has now been revealed as it is. Because before this crisis, it seemed, did it not, or at least they portrayed it, to be a kind of football game where, different teams called parties scored goals and conceded goals and went up and down the league table. And then, at the end of a particular term in office, they got the prize of forming a government that was not in power. And politicians were always hiding behind their powerlessness. But now we see that government is immensely powerful. And in the end, that Lenin was always right when he said that politics is about who does what to whom. Tonight, I have the great joy and privilege to be joined by an economist, a professor, an activist, but above all else, and this is what I want to emphasize, a great friend, a brother, member of the family, and a comrade in arms. Jamie Galbraith, welcome to Another Now. Thank you for joining us all the way from sunny Austin. I suspect it must be sunny by now. If not,
it's actually quite cloudy and cool here. It's great to be with you.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. So how is life in Austin these days?
A little quieter than normal. The student population was dispersed in March, and this has been quite far from being one of the worst affected communities, although it obviously has been devastating for the local, the local commerce and the local business community and the local working community. But compared to a lot of other places, it has been relatively calm here in the last several months.
Well, universities are fantastic when the students are not there, aren't they? I mean, I always like the idea of a university without students. Don't tell anyone.
I spent the first month or 6 weeks in the 800 square feet of my third floor here, in the space that you can see. And since then, I've been going out as far as the little park at the base of my street and walking around it for an hour or so each day. So I've seen a lot of my neighbors, and I've seen a lot of the local flowering plants. And for the rest, I've been watching it as everybody else has over electronic medium.
Indeed, it is as if we do occupy exactly the same spot in the universe, whatever our screen shows us. And I suspect we read and watch more or less the same stuff.
Yep.
Look, before we start the usual fare of another now, let me just jump in to American politics very briefly and then jump right straight out again, because it's very
Sure.
devastatingly boring these days. Is Joe Biden going to be the nominee in the end who takes on Donald Trump? Is the Democratic Party going to commit this crime against logic?
Well, he's the only candidate. And so long as that's the case, it's likely that when the convention comes around, they will cast their votes for him. Frankly, the fate of the Democratic Party doesn't rest on the electors. It doesn't rest on the convention delegates. This is a candidate who's supported by, who came into the race with the support of the establishment in order to defeat Bernie Sanders. There were others. He wasn't the only one, but he was the one who became the designated survivor, if you like. What the establishment decides is what will happen. At the moment, they appear to be backing him, and that appears to be the most likely outcome. Now,
do you think he can?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, just the standard question.
Can he win? Can he win? It depends on whether you believe the polls. My belief is that the polls will converge toward the close to the election, as they always do. That they're not meaningful now. And we're many months away from the election, if indeed a proper election is held. In previous elections, this tends to comes down to a narrow decision in a handful of states, and I expect that will be the case again, but we don't know.
Okay, let's jump straight out again from contemporary American politics and do that which we always do here in Another Now. Go back to your formative years. Growing up under the very large shadow of another Galbraith that some people may remember. Tell us about it.
Oh, I was in the second cohort of my parents' children. I was born in 1952. And at that point, my father was really in the ascendant phase of his career. I spent, of course, a very interesting couple of years in India, but I was I escaped home at the age of 14, went off to boarding school, didn't like it, escaped from there, went to France on a program, and then escaped from there and went to Berkeley. My formative years passed relatively quickly, and I would say that my relationship with my father became most intense during the Vietnam War period. As a teenager, I had the opposite trajectory of most people of my generation who rebelled against their parents. My father was from the beginning the leading voice in opposition to that war. That was a degree of family harmony that was unheard of in the country in those days. That persisted right through, largely to the end. I became an economist in the belief that I would not be competing with him contemporaneously, and I misestimated that by about 30 years.
And your father was remarkable in the sense that not only was he erudite and progressive, but he actually became more progressive and slightly more erudite as he got on.
Oh, I think if you go back to as early, certainly as I can remember, but even before that, he came into politics from a farming background. He was a very practical person. He did not have an academic formation. He had a degree in animal husbandry and a PhD in agricultural economics. his approach to things was always that of a very politically hard-headed person. I mean, when he was in his early 30s, he was in charge of every price in the United States for a year, and that gave him let's just say, a comfortable view of the exercise of power, which he never relinquished. He was always, you can go through his letters, which are now available, enormously voluminous, and he was intervening sharply and with a good deal of perception all the way through. He was one of the first people to suggest the Marshall Plan, for example. And one can go through an enormous list of things that just never ends. I did I even did, as I did some research in economic history, I kept finding traces of his influence on all kinds of things you would find it hard to imagine. The location of ammunition factories for the mobilization for the Second World War, just for example. I mean,
but what you're portraying as a kind of demerit, that he didn't have a very solid theoretical background in economics.
No, on the contrary, it was a great merit.
Exactly, that's the point I'm trying to make.
It was a great merit. No, he approached these questions without any, academically preconceived beliefs, and so he was entirely free of the dogmas of classical and neoclassical economics. That's what gave him that, plus the ability to write in English, gave him his power.
Can you imagine if you tried to be the price czar, the fixer of every price in the American economy during the war economy, if you believed in the general equilibrium models of prices? It would just be impossible to do it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the way to do this was you started with what had been done in the First World War, and you improved on it. And then you adjusted very quickly when you realized that the things you were doing weren't working. And they did that repeatedly over the course of the life of that agency. Now, that was years before I was born, but still, as I say, it gives you a feel for the flexibility and that he had, flexibility of mind and willingness to trust his judgment. Yeah.
And of course, it helped fixing prices. The fact that they were already fixed by the cartels. Unlike what economic theory
that was the first discovery, was that you can fix prices when the big corporations had already fixed them, that it was not that difficult a thing to do, and then you just had to make exceptions. And I asked him, where do you find 17,000 people to run prices in the United States? He said, land-grant colleges. I hired all the economists, all the institutional economists who were little too old to fight, wanted to do something. So he just brought in people. All kinds of very interesting people, lots of people who went on to shape the post-war world, went through that agency in those years.
Well, let's make a segue directly from the 1940s to the here and now, because I've been reading your stuff, and we've been chatting for a while now during this lockdown, and it seems to me that you are calling for similar measures as those practiced during the war economy for the lockdown economy or the coronavirus economy.
Yes, well, that was my first instinct, was that this was a mobilization problem. And I think that instinct was correct. There are two aspects to it. One was assuring you had the appropriate supplies, medical supplies, protective equipment, hospital beds, and food and medicines, the basics that people needed, while everybody else was hunkered down. And the other was the mobilization of the population to ensure that you broke the chain of transmission of the disease. And you had to hold those things in place long enough to do the trick. And it turns out that we've now come through that experience, and some societies were capable of doing it and others were not. And the ones that were not were the neoliberal societies, the ones that were, and you mentioned this earlier when you just started speaking, the ones that were based upon basically a credit and debt economy that had become extremely fragile in the run up to this, and were hit at a moment of extreme fragility, and they broke, and they were not able politically and socially to withstand the pressure to get the job done. And now they are in this kind of extremely boggy situation of trying to resume economic activity, which will not resume, and they're going to find that they're falling short on both Well, we don't know quite what's going to happen to the epidemic, but it doesn't look good. Let's just say that that they have not got the job done. And at the same time, on the economic front, they're not going to be able to achieve what they think they can achieve, precisely because they believe in this general equilibrium model. Everything's going to go back to a previous normal without any consequences for having been interrupted for a period of months. But that isn't going to happen. And it's obvious to anybody who can look around and see it that it isn't.
I believe they can see it too. This talk about a V-shaped recovery
Well,
has
anybody who has a business understanding of this has seen this from the beginning, and they've been positioning themselves. But you have, you have the political people and the economists surrounding them who say, "Oh, they desperately want to win the election," and so they've been talking themselves into the belief that there'll be a fast recovery. It's an illusion, obviously, but any business person will tell you that nobody who makes is in any, let's say, the supply of aircraft parts thinks that there's a business there. I mean, half the planes are on the ground. I mean,
not only are they on the ground, but not only are they on the ground, but they cease to function as a store of value, because Lufthansa was assuming that because it owned its airplanes, it could use them as collateral to borrow money. Now that the collateral has gone down the toilet, so it can't even borrow money. So it's knocking on the door.
They're not commercially. The government will lend money in the United States to a large corporation. We see that. They have that. They got 500 billion right out of the starting gate, so they can be kept up. They can be propped up for a while and have been. But the planes are, the planes remain airworthy. If they simply be scrapped, you'd have a better chance of restarting the whole industrial process. But they're not going to be scrapped.
That's where the difference lies with the war economy. That's where the difference lies with the war economy. During the war economy, capital stock was destroyed.
Right, exactly. You made it and then you blew it up. But that doesn't happen so much in the civilian economy.
Well, let's take the three major economic blocks one at a time. In brief, let's begin with China, because unbeknownst to most of our viewers, you have a very strong connection with China, whether you like it or not. It lives in your home.
Wait a minute, I do like it.
Yeah, well, okay.
Who would not like it?
She's called Ying. She's
married to it for almost 30 years now.
She's a formidable member of the household, as well as a citizen of the People's Republic of China, your wife. Right. So you know China very well. Beyond all the noise regarding what the president of China knew, what he didn't know, what happened in Wuhan, and so on, what's your assessment of the way China handled the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, one thing that's clear, that China met the two criteria I just mentioned before. They had the production base, and they were able to sustain the population through the what was required to break the transmission, and a very, very severe lockdown in the whole country, but especially in Hubei province with 60 million people. So they achieved that. And the second thing that they achieved was the ability to resume afterwards. And that is fundamentally because the Chinese economy is not rooted in the same levels of debt, of land rent, and that the Western economies are. And this has been true. I did some economic work in China 25 years ago. It was true then. It's probably somewhat less true now, but it's still a big difference between China and the rest. So you can have. They were also able to essentially mobilize the whole population. So it was an extremely socially unified response to this crisis. And I don't want to minimize how unified it was in parts of the West too. I think that even in the United States, there was a great deal of community response, even though the national government fell apart on this issue. But in China, it was really, really beyond remarkable how effective it was, and also the role of the state in fostering it was also very strong. But the essential thing is that the economy was proved to be much more resilient and able to begin to resume activity than will be true in the U.S. or the UK or I think in continental Europe as well. And that that's showing up right now. There's a major distinction between the two regions.
Would you also agree that within China, while there is a large credit bubble, it is contained within the confines of China? And the fact that capital controls remain in place and the central government can effectively write off debt, private or public.
Capital controls were under discussion when I was there in the 1990s, and they did not relax them then. And they maintained them. They maintained an infrastructure that goes back, many years now, that provides. They were able to mobilize in the public health domain as well. But the fact that they had capital controls and they had means that and China does have credit bubbles, as real estate bubbles and stock bubbles and so forth, but they are contained, and the capacity to write down those debts or simply to ignore them is there as necessary. And that's because the banking sector is essentially it's a state-controlled sector. It's a policy-driven sector. And this has always been the case and since the beginning of the reform period, when they started, having a banking sector that meant something. I remember 25, 30 years ago, Western economists saying, oh, the non-performing loans in the Chinese banks are going to bring the system down. And it hasn't happened. And so long as they retain their national autonomy, it doesn't need to happen because, as I say, it's the same reason that the U.S. government can run a public budget deficit. So these things are under national control. The U.S. has also its flexibility in the public sector, but it doesn't extend to a banking sector. Is something which is periodically has to be bailed out in the United States, but that doesn't save the borrowers. Whereas the Chinese have the capacity to do what they like in that respect.
They have the capacity for symmetric bailouts or symmetric haircuts.
That's essentially right. I think that's right.
The United States doesn't want to have.
Yeah.
The United States federal government. The beauty, of course, of the United States is the exorbitant power of the dollar that affords this degree of flexibility to the federal government. But when it comes, for instance, to public health systems, even transportation systems, the federal government has nothing like the Chinese capacity to mobilize health services, transportation in a manner that is coherent and responsive to a need like the pandemic is introducing.
Well, the federal government in the United States has a lot of potential power in that respect. It does have legislative enactments, statutes that are already on the books, the Defense Production Act, which is used by the Pentagon hundreds of thousands of times a year to preempt private contractors on military matters. Those powers are there. The Congress is there. It can enact new statutes as required. It just didn't do it. It didn't use those powers. It refused to invoke them. And when Congress did act, it acted on a paradigm of basically pumping money through the system, which was, first of all, very uneven in its effect. And secondly, doesn't address the supply issues and doesn't address the long-term sustainability, doesn't address the debt question. So you end up with essentially approaching this with a very defective vision of what you're facing. It was approached in many respects as though it was a characteristic financial crisis like the last one, and that you could find a new set of credit instruments to essentially put the economy back on a growth path, as though the interruption could be symmetrically reversed. And what's happened, of course, is that again we have a lot of capital assets that are on the ground that are now in excess supply. Nobody's going to build new ones. We have massive changes in consumer behavior, which is going to affect their willingness to go out and purchase. And then you have the public health constraints on a great many things, which slows the return of economic activity. So yes, people come out of their houses. They may go to the beaches and so forth where they have them. Whether that's safe or not is another thing, but we're seeing that over the last few days. But are they going to get back on airplanes, and are they going to purchase new automobiles? Are they going to build new commercial office buildings? Are they going to build new retail outlets? The answer to those questions is almost surely not, and not for quite some time. And so a lot of what has been driving the American economy, not to mention, sporting events and anything that involves bringing people together in large numbers, that is a part of a commercial activity, conventions, resorts, all of these things are flat on their backs. And the government didn't see that this was going to be the case, or at least if it did, it didn't act as though it needed to restructure the economy from the beginning. And of course, we have this caught up in this rhetoric of reopening. Reopening what? Are there people there, the millions of people or hundreds of thousands that we need for contact tracing and symptom monitoring, and generally making sure that the environments people go into are reasonably safe and secure? They're not there. Well, we haven't done it. And those things, the federal government could have done those things. It just didn't get its act together to do them.
Those outside the United States find one unfathomable aspect of the place, and that is healthcare. The emphasis on private healthcare, which is clearly failing. In that context, do you think that this crisis may have edged public opinion closer to Bernie Sanders' idea of Medicare for all?
There's no
do you see the movement?
Yeah,
do you see
no
any movement even by Joe Biden to adopt Medicare for all? Because he hasn't yet. He's been a steadfast opponent.
There's no question it's overwhelmingly moved public opinion. It's very obvious that the healthcare system doesn't work. Health insurance system doesn't work. People who are many millions now, approaching, I guess, roughly 40 million people who've lost their jobs, will get they're insured through their employer. They have to go on to another health insurance option at that point if they can afford it. And this is changing I mean, there is a sort of grudging recognition, but the fact remains that the health insurance industry is a large, powerful, well-funded industry with a lot of political leverage, and basically replacing it, as you would need to do, it's still not going. It's not something that's going to happen easily, even if there were a new presidency who decided that was what you had to do. You haven't got I mean, it's still going to take a big fight to make something like that happen. But at the same time, it's clear that this is the dysfunction of the system is very, very apparent and will become more so. I have to say, was it as bad as it might have been? The answer to that is no. And the reason for that is that during the lockdown, people stayed home, and very few traffic accidents. There were very few work accidents. There were very few other infectious diseases. So hospitals actually were empty because they did all their other clients. And this caused, in the American system, a financial problem for the hospitals because they're reimbursed on a fee-for-service basis. And so with the empty beds, they're saying, where are all the sick people who we rely on to stay afloat? And that, you say, you can't make this up. Nobody would have invented this system in which, but effectively, in many respects, except for the epidemic, a decline in health problems actually produces financial difficulties for the healthcare system.
Well, there is a similar system called the privatized prison system that would go completely bust if crime was not committed. The whole needs problems in order to keep surviving.
But the private prison system isn't as big a piece of the thing, I don't think, as the private healthcare system, private and nonprofit.
Sure. Yeah. Before we move to Europe, and we shall move to Europe in a minute, I've got a question for you. You can answer it, and we will ask our viewers not to reveal your answer, to keep it between us. 4 years ago, when we were discussing the Hillary versus Donald question, we all said, what can you do? If we were voters, I mean, you are a voter. But if we were voters in a swing state, you are not a voter in a swing state. You're in Texas, for God's sakes. But if we were in a swing state, we will, hold our nose like that and vote for Hillary to keep Donald out. In November, are you going to vote for Biden?
I am a religious Democrat, which is to say, I have the relationship that many people feel toward their church. However ambivalent about it, it's exceedingly hard to leave. So the answer to that is yes, I will vote for Biden. Of course I will. Is this what you would hope to have happen in this country? No, obviously. But at the same time, I'm not a sort to think that these problems are the kind of crisis that we're facing is the work of a late arriving individual. And I think it's important as a professional to understand that the reason the U.S. economy has crumbled under the impact of the coronavirus is not simply that it had a federal government in the hands of this particular gang. It really has to do with the way in which the economy has been engineered over the last 40 years, and in particular in the return from the financial crisis of 13 years ago. And what happened was that rather than reconstructing the financial sector and pursuing a balanced recovery, and rather than rebuilding a balance between the public and the private sector, was that we had an economic expansion that was predicated on a great deal, particularly on capital asset valuations on the stock market, driven by the corporate sector, which issued debt to buy back its own stocks and became very highly leveraged, and then securitized that debt. So it was a process in a different channel that led to the last financial crisis. That was mortgages. This was corporate debt. And you could tell that once the base of profitability ran out, you're going to run into systemic problems, very big systemic problems. It happened very fast as a result of the epidemic. But that this was not the invention of this administration. It wasn't the invention of the previous administration. It's the invention of a whole set of ideas about how you run the economy, and that's where we have to begin. Now, obviously, the political sector is not thinking along those lines, and my view is one has to continue to work to change this perception, because until you really have a serious change in the way we think about how the system is structured, we're going to stumble along, and we're going to stumble along under the impact both of the biological event of the epidemic and of the failure to recognize what the source of the difficulties is. And that happened in the 30s. That happened from 1929 to the end of 32 and start of 1933. It took 4 years, 4 years of deepening disaster. Basically, investment went to nothing in 1932. And that finally brought in the change that defined my father's life and really defined the whole era. That certainly brackets my life as well. And one had a period of dramatic experimentation and reconstruction and development and positive change. Essentially, if I hark back to a historical period, that's the one I think you have to hark back to and think about, really understand what you have to think about and what you have to do and how you have to reorganize things. But it's understandable that people don't want to do that. They hold on to illusions that what was 6 months ago can be restored.
Of course, these illusions are particularly lucrative for some.
Sure, of course.
These are motivated failures.
Yeah.
They are not unmotivated errors.
Yeah, that well,
because,
in certain respects, that's true. And once assets are devalued, houses and corporate assets and everything else, there somebody can come along who has some access to credit or has some capital and pick them up for cheap. And I'm sure that's very much. I mean, I know that's very much in people's minds. And there was short selling in the market. The governmental response was delayed, and there were intelligence briefings, which even some senators sold out their stock positions in January when they understood what was going to happen. But other people sold short and there was a report of, I think, 300 and some $billion of profits made by short selling the market. So yes, there's basically a fork in the road that can happen. The more likely one is the grim possibility that people will simply be foreclosed, evicted, that their commercial properties will be shut down, and eventually they'll be bought up and demolished, and God knows if anything will happen to them. But this will become a very concentrated economy with many millions of people who are homeless and who have no source of support, and the collapse in the state and local government services, which depend upon their tax revenues, property taxes and sales taxes. And that's also very much in the offing at the present time. So all of that is one possibility, and my view is that it's not a tolerable It's obviously not tolerable, but it's not something which can be supported politically for the reason that the people who are affected by it were doing what they were supposed to do. They were doing what was part of the public effort to defeat the disease, staying home. They were took the furloughs from their jobs or were laid off. But this was all part of a common national effort. If you then tell them, well, just because you couldn't pay your mortgage, you now have to lose your house, or you can't pay your rent, you're going to be evicted and thrown out on the street. Good luck holding that in. I don't think that's going to work. Ultimately, I think that the other fork in the road is the one that has to be seriously taken up and considered. And that really is to say, at the end of the day, what has to give here is the structure of debts. The financial structure here, which has become basically unsustainable, needs to be written down, written off. That can happen. That's what they did in the 30s, ultimately, was that they wrote down and wrote off the debts.
But the key point you made is ultimately, you mentioned before the period between 1929 and 1932, 33, just before FDR came in with his New Deal. But it seems to me that the difference with our era, because our 1929, of course, took place in 2008. In our 1929, the difference was that the central banks of the G20 coordinated money printing and refloated the financial sector, unlike in 1929. So the way I feel it, Jamie, is that, the period between 1929 and 1932, that was 3 years. But with the cortisone that has been applied by central banks after 2008, that period has been stretched and stretched and stretched. And that is what creates very low levels of investment, because the money printed by the Fed, the Central Bank of Europe, of Bank of England, Bank of Japan, it refloats asset prices, it refloats stock exchanges, it refloats the financial sector, but it does not go into investment into things society needs. And so you have this amazing incongruity between, liquidity available in investment that creates deflationary forces. Those beget political monsters all over the globe. And that creates the fragility you're talking about, and the huge amount of private debts, because people simply don't have the incomes, so they have to rely more and more on private debt during the good times, and then coronavirus comes. So it seems to me that, this is worse than the 1930s, because in the 1930s, at least, we had to have, FDR had no alternative, or somebody had to do it, had to come in and restructure that, because they didn't have this toxicity of the liquidity, which is zombifying the financial sector, keeping asset prices up and destroys everyone else.
Well, yeah, up to a point. There are things which didn't exist in the 1930s that continue to function. Social Security in the United States continues to function, and so long as the government is bailing out, the corporate debtors, then the bonds are not defaulting massively, and that supports a great many people who have retirement funds and this kind of thing. So the structure is different. One has to think about it quite carefully. But at the same time, there's no way that helps, let's say, a Boeing, major American manufacturer of aircraft. There's no way it helps anybody who's trying to maintain a commercial establishment, a retail mall. I saw a report, I don't know if it's accurate, that 90% of American malls could close, that landlords are sending out default notices to their commercial clients right now by the thousands. And this is an implosion of an extent, because the American economy depends upon, it's very largely an economy floated by, by suburban expansion and commercial retail of this kind. So it seems to me that that there are certain things that financial bailouts simply can't achieve. And
Indeed.
that, I don't know whether it means 3 years, 6 years, or whether we have some political motion in a shorter period of time, 1 or 2. Another thing that actually makes it possible that it's shorter is that in the 1930s, there were a lot more people in the countryside. And so there was a lot more that was, in the local provision. And now we are very urban, and that requires that supply chains continue to function and that incomes continue to be adequate to meet basic requirements. And it's possible that could crack apart even more quickly than it did in the early 30s. Not sure, but it's I think one has to think about these things in terms of the actual systems that are there right now.
Okay, well, we've been to China, we've been to the United States. Let's come to the stupid continent of the world, Europe. Before I give you the floor again, let me say, for the benefit of our audience, that you and I have worked for years trying to come up with sensible solutions to the Eurozone crisis, to the never-ending Euro area stagnation. 10 years now. We could have started earlier because the signs were on the wall even before that. How do you assess Europe's predicament at the moment?
Well, when you take Europe all together, it has a disturbing resemblance to the United States in some respects, in the sense that there's no central authority that is capable of bringing the continent back from the brink in an orderly and coordinated and effective way, and that's been the struggle. When you take it as country by country, then you have to deal with all the diversity. And of course, the places like the UK, very neoliberal, have come to a much worse experience. Places that were afflicted by austerity and ran down their public health systems, and Italy and Spain and France to a very substantial degree, and got hit very hard. People, those that were fast and that maintained, and you have this experience in Greece that in spite of everything, there seems to have been something about the society held together through this. So you've got a diversity of experiences. That's also true to a degree inside the United States. In terms of where we are in terms of facing up to the issues that have afflicted the Eurozone, you're no doubt much closer to that than I am. And obviously, there's been some movement, and it probably helps to have at least one national leader, and I'm referring to Chancellor Merkel, who knows something about science. And at the end of the day, whatever one may think of her, one has to compare her to, for example, the leadership in the United States.
She does know about science, but not about economics.
Well, that is of course a problem. That is of course a problem. But as I say, would I trade Donald Trump for Angela Merkel?
That's a no-brainer. But that's
New York Minute, as they say. What?
That's damning Merkel with faint praise, isn't it?
Well, it's, let's just say, considered judgment.
Well, look, a couple of points and then a larger one, and then I'll pass the floor on to you again. Firstly, regarding Britain, you refer to Britain as neoliberal. There's no doubt about that if you look at the period from 1979 onwards. But it is very interesting that this government has point blank refused to countenance austerity. There's been a lot of there's a great push from the Treasury towards both the Chancellor of the Exchequer and Boris Johnson to adopt austerity, and they are refusing it. And they are loosening up the purse strings as if there is no tomorrow, and they seem to be doing this from a position of almost an ideological opposition to austerity, which is a very interesting development, given that this is happening in the United Kingdom. Then you mentioned Greece, that somehow we managed to hold this together. We have a very small number of deaths from COVID-19, but I very much fear that we're going to have the largest number of deaths from hunger as a result of the economic affliction. And also, our government loves to portray itself as the paragon of epidemiological expertise and success. And we have countries next to us like Albania and Bulgaria that did more or less nothing during this period, and they have the same very low infection rate and death count. So the Balkans were very lucky to escape, maybe by accident, the trajectory of the infection. Regarding Merkel's economics and what's happening in Europe, I need to say this for the benefit of our audience and then ask you to comment. Yet again, we have, on the one hand, the same category error that we had in 2010 in the Eurocrisis. They keep treating this problem as, from an economic point of view, as one that can be solved by means of loans, as if it is an illiquidity problem as opposed to an avalanche of bankruptcies. And secondly, again, we have a lot of wonderful announcements, which if you hold them up against the light for more than 5 seconds, they just vanish. We have the so-called recovery fund of 500 billion, which if you look at it, it just doesn't exist. There's no money there. We have these fantastic announcements of effectively common debt until you look more carefully into them. And again, their macroeconomic impact is insignificant. And what really matters, Jamie, and I want to put this to you, is that with everything they have done, while they have opened up the purse and allowed for monies to be lent, especially for European stability mechanism and through the markets with QE, quantitative easing, all that money is going to be added to the burden of national debt and national deficit. And given that Mrs. Merkel, whom you mentioned quite in a complimentary fashion before, has already declared that the German federal budget next year is going to go back to the black zero, the Schwarz Null. There's no doubt that immediately when they hit zero, they will demand of Brussels that Brussels demands of Rome, Madrid, Athens, and so on, the elimination of budget deficits. And given that the budget deficit in Greece and Italy will be something like minus 12% of GDP, we're talking about the prospect of gigantic new austerity hitting us next year and in the years to come. Just as Europe is escaping from the coronavirus malaise, we're going to be hit by austerity that is equivalent of that of 2010, 2011.
Well, and I therefore retract any intimation of generosity in my previous remarks, because obviously this is not going to work, and Europe will be destroyed, and it will collapse under this. And that's you're at the situation where the wolf is at the door, it seems to me impossible that you could enforce that kind of adjustment on Italy at this stage without having a breakup, just for example, without having a breakup of the EU in practice, if not in name. So I wonder if that's what basically
is not going to be there for very long.
Strategy at this point.
And you have to remember that Merkel, who is the smartest amongst them, as you said, is not going to be there for very long.
Yeah, of course.
She's on her way out. So you see, I'm not saying that they will demand of Italy that they go back to a primary surplus. But if Italy has a budget surplus, a deficit of minus 12, and say to Italy, okay, we will show maximum flexibility. Do you remember when you and I were around the corridors of the Eurogroup, they were always talking about maximum flexibility? Well, yes, okay, we will hit you over the head with a blunt instrument, but we will wrap it up in newspaper. That's what they mean. So they will say to the Italians, okay, don't go to a primary surplus, but you have to go from -12 to -2. That's 10 percentage points of austerity in a country like Italy.
It can't be done. I mean, as I say, at that point, you're basically calling an end to the whole experiment, the whole project.
But can you imagine the alternative scenario? Can you imagine Berlin saying, okay, we will go to the Schwarz Null, to the black zero, but it's okay, let Italy not. Do you see this being politically fathomable?
You're the better judge of that. My instinct would be to say no, that they can't do that either.
My instinct is that it won't happen either. They will insist.
Yeah.
They will insist. And you see, this is the difference with the United States. You said that the two continents look more or less the same. Well, the difference is that you have a federal budget that it can take all this rubbish, into it, and it can expand majestically its deficits, and nobody cares.
Yeah, no, it helps in the U.S. and the U.K. to have governments which are completely free of any debt to principle, and or any commitment to principles, and willing to say to pass what I mean. The U.S. You're right, 500 billion compared to the 5 or 6 trillion that are on the table. The United States is for an economy of comparable size is essentially a trivial sum. And even if it were there, which as you tell me is not, it's not. The U.S. is sustained by its willingness to suspend all pretense of principle in an emergency. But at the same time, what we failed to do here was to organize. We failed to do this in an effective way. We failed to mobilize the resources, and so we're sitting there still struggling with basics like testing and contact tracing and symptom monitoring and other things that would enable us to have more normal lives with some degree of security. And we can see that they're calculating to allow the infections to go up and then to lock them down again. And they're struggling to get through November. Elections in the US are a very good thing because they suspend economic principle. You have to make the economy work in order to get through them. But in these circumstances, you're looking at it's easy to say that unless something happens that really is that causes this thing to burn out on its own, and I can't predict the epidemiology or the biology of this, but I don't think it's very likely, and that's not what the models are saying. Then we're looking at seriously intractable problem, and one which, to come back to the U.S., the U.S. doesn't solve this problem, then nobody else in the world can really solve it. Because you can't break the connections completely. And so the fact that the Chinese or the Vietnamese or the Koreans or the many other places, New Zealand and other places have got this under control is very provisional, so long as there's a huge economy out here in Europe or the United States that has failed to do so.
Okay, it's time to get your crystal ball out. Imagine that this is December 2030. And we assume that we're both alive and kicking and in reasonably good nick. And you are asked by The Atlantic, or if it still exists, or some venerable publication, to write a review of the 2020s. What do you think you will be writing in that review in December 2030?
Oh, that's hard.
Yeah, that's the whole point, to end up with a bang, not with a whimper.
At the moment, I'm having a very great difficulty writing anything because
No, it's not now. It's December 2030.
I understand that. I'm just saying where I am now because my crystal ball is very cloudy. 6 weeks, 2 months ago, I was writing furiously along the themes that you and I are familiar with about what was necessary. It was not in the expectation that things would happen along those lines, but that at least you could begin to get people focused to think about how things should happen. And that's not the way it developed. The fact is, it's extremely hard. So what do I think I'm right about? I mean, I think it's entirely possible that the European Union will fall apart and then the United States will fall apart. And that we will see that what happened to Yugoslavia, what happened to the Soviet Union was a precursor of what may happen to us. If that's the case, it's because we allowed an incompetent political leadership, and we allowed a failure of our own ability to respond competently, seriously, and in an organized and effective way, unified way, to a major problem, to a major crisis. This is, one thing talks about the effect of Chernobyl, for example, on the Soviet space. Well, this is not entirely different in important respects. And it really, it will change people's attitudes toward the systems in which they live, in which way over 10 years, we'll say, well, okay, the political systems under which we operated before are not viable. I would like to think that that's different, and that we will have another rebirth, another revival, another, let's just say, major reconstruction effort. But material conditions are different. The psychological conditions are different, and the polarization is extreme, and let's just say the criminal incapacity of the political elite is much more profound now. So I hate to end on a note which is as grim as this, but if you ask me what I think might happen in 10 years, I don't think you can rule out that the systems that we're in will simply not be there, and we will have suffered major, long-standing decline in our living standards and in our social coherence. We will ask ourselves what happened. We'll look back over a half a century when we allowed ourselves to be led down garden paths of various kinds, in particular if you like, the neoliberal one, the idea that we can allow essentially self-organization and market forces to control and credit institutions to run the societies. That we do that, we're going to get the kind of instability and inequality and precarity and difficulty and eventually social strains that blow things apart. That kind of illusion produces.
Well, one of the tragedies, but also this is a credit to you, is that even though, as you say, it's the last few weeks that have caused a great deal of pessimism to descend upon us, upon me. I gave a very dystopic lecture on the Cambridge Union the other day, 2 days ago. Well, if our viewers want to read two books that were very prescient about that, one is called The Predatory State, and the other is called The End of Normal, and Jamie Galbraith happens to be the author of both. I don't think that when you were writing them, you were sort of trying to predict the current predicament, but in a sense, they both add a great deal of substance to the bleakness that surrounds us.
Well, I had the advantage of having spent my career as an ambulance chaser of financial crises going back to 1975 in New York City when I was on the congressional staff. The Predator State I wrote in response largely to the Hurricane Katrina, and they just brought that very sharply into focus, and how the political system of the United States was basically feeding on institutions that had been built up in the 20th century. And The End of Normal was an assessment of what happened after the financial crisis, and what happened leading up to the financial crisis, and especially of the economic ideas that underpinned those developments, and then looking forward at the way technology and energy and the collapse of effective military power. So all of these things played into the economic conditions. I was surprised, and well, I think the ability of the system to carry on for another 13 years but was something I didn't fully expect, and partly because material conditions were different from what I expected. But the underlying analysis, I think, was sound, and it showed what the epidemic showed was that it hit a system that become extremely fragile, and there's now cracked apart in a way which, as I said, we've been talking about, very, very difficult to restore. We have to really think about how to reorganize ourselves. I know there've been many questions about universal basic income, job guarantee, and so forth. I'm very much on the job side of that debate. I think the important thing is to have an organized society that's doing things, and we have vast tasks that need to be done, and we can get people to work on them and achieve things, then we can build a way forward. But that's what I can continue to work on. But come back to at the end of the day, I keep coming back to William of Orange. It is not necessary to hope in order to persevere. You have to keep going and working on these things.
Indeed. And speaking of getting things done and defeating fear and fearing fear itself, as FDR said, let me remind you, but mainly our audience, that you and I were together in a number of places when conflicts of note were taking place, but we were also together at the end of November 2018 in Vermont, when we made an open call for a progressive international, and now it is coming together. I hope to see you in September in Reykjavik, if we can travel. If not, we will do it by teleconference. But the Progressive International is really taking shape. We have a capacity to be hopeful without being optimistic through this collaboration with thousands of people across the globe. Some wonderful people and movements are joining us. And Jamie, you are going to be part of it, whether you like it or not. Again, I know you like it. Let me just come to the end. Thank you for joining Another Now. The very notion of Another Now is a hopeful one, even though we are not issuing any optimistic predictions whatsoever. We'll chat again very soon in this forum, in other fora. Say hello to the family from all of us, because the personal is political. We miss you all, Danai and I. We are missing Austin, we're missing Ying, the kids, Emma, Eve, all of you. Carpe diem, as we say, hugs. Thank you.
Carpe diem. Okay, it's one of the great pleasures of being able to work with you and with everybody in DiEM and Progressive International. I'm very happy to be part of it. So let's carry on.
See you soon. Let's carry on.
Right.